On September 22nd, 1980, airstrikes suddenly rang out across Iran's air bases. As their armed forces scrambled to put together a response, reports came in of a full ground invasion of the western border, spearheaded in 3 locations. Immediately, it was clear what was happening. The tensions with Iraq had finally snapped, and Saddam Hussein was now launching a full-scale invasion of Iran. What followed was 8 years of tank battles, trench warfare, and human wave tactics on a scale not seen since the First World War, and even the use of chemical weapons. Today on Warographics, we're going to take a look at the devastating Iran-Iraq War and the ghost it left behind in the Middle East. As strange as it sounds from a 21st century perspective, Iran used to be one of the strongest allies of the Western world. Viewed as a crucial nation in resisting Soviet expansion in the Middle East, Iran was armed to the teeth with some of the West's best weapons, tanks, and even aircraft such as the supersonic American F-4 Phantom and the advanced F-14 Tomcat. They were not only a serious regional power. In fact, in the 1970s, it was estimated by many military experts that Iran possessed the 5th or 6th most powerful armed forces on the planet. 25,000 American technicians were sent to teach their Iranian counterparts how to maintain the foreign military equipment, and Iranian pilots traveled to the United States for training. It was growing into an alliance for the ages. But this friendship was about to be shattered essentially overnight. In the late 1970s, Iran was gripped by a national revolution. What began as mere demonstrations escalated over the months as businesses were burned and fighting began breaking out with the government. Without getting into too much detail, many were upset with the way the Shah, or the king, had been running his country as an authoritarian monarch, and the people wanted him gone. His 26-year-long reign came to an end when in 1979 guerrilla fighters defeated the Shah's troops in vicious street fighting in Tehran, paving the way for a referendum to establish a new constitution, and this one was centered around their interpretation of Shia Islam. The new head of state, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, now commanded an Islamist theocracy, one that rapidly became anti-West in nature, breaking off many ties and agreements with their former allies. But this came with some drawbacks. The chaos had resulted in lots of trained pilots and engineers fleeing the country, leaving numerous complicated foreign vehicles in the hands of understaffed and undertrained teams. To make matters worse, Khomeini was now the country's supreme leader, and he quickly ordered a purge of his armed forces. Dozens of high-ranking officials were executed, and many more were imprisoned or exiled. In total, more than 12,000 officers were removed from their position, skilled pilots and mechanics had been exiled or killed in the revolution, and thousands deserted their ranks to flee the purges. Iran's once invincible army was now on the verge of crumbling from neglect. The whole world had their eyes on Iran at the time. After all, this was all huge news around the globe. But one country was more concerned with the turn of events than anyone else. Iran's neighbor to the west, Iraq. Iran and Iraq had been at each other's throats for quite a while by this point. Border clashes over the Shatt al-Arab River throughout the early 1970s had already led to more than 1,000 deaths. This issue was supposed to be resolved in the 1975 Algiers Agreement, which carved up the area, splitting it between the two nations, and it also called for a ceasefire. Aside from the border disputes, Iran had also been wary of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in Iraq, and for years had been supporting Kurdish rebels that were fighting the Iraqi government, sending them both financial and military aid. The Algiers Agreement was supposed to put an end to this as well, and was part of the reason Iraq signed the agreement, despite it slightly favoring Iran. But the treaty didn't fix much of anything. Kurdish rebels continued their struggle just a short while later, leading to years of brutal fighting that caused 100,000 Kurdish refugees to flee into Turkey. Not to mention Iraq wasn't too pleased with the way negotiations had gone in the first place, but for a while, they weren't in much of a position to do anything about that. But you can imagine Saddam's eyes widening when the Iranian Revolution succeeded in overthrowing the government. Their country was in chaos and their army was weakened. Not to mention, he could now justify military action as an act to prevent the ideology of the Islamic Revolution from potentially spreading into Iraq. Throw in the fact that a quick defeat could cause Iran's new government to quickly collapse, and you're starting to weave together a perfect basket of excuses to go to war. On September the 22nd, 1980, the Iraqi invasion began. Iraq was confident that their men and ground equipment were superior. Their main worry was the Iranian Air Force. So, in an effort to cripple their aircraft before they even got off the ground, Iraq began their invasion with a surprise bombing run of Iranian airfields, perhaps inspired by Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. 10 air bases were the main targets, but Iraq failed to do much damage to them, mostly due to a lack of aircraft capable of striking so deep into enemy territory. But even at the airfields that managed to get hit, such as in Tehran, which was bombed by 3 Iraqi MiG-23s, Iran's jets emerged mostly unscathed, having been safely hidden inside hardened aircraft shelters that protected them from the blasts. The only real damage was done to runways, which were quickly repaired. Regardless of the early setbacks in the skies, back on the ground, Iraqi divisions were on the move. Later that day, they began their assault, crossing the border into Iran in a 3-pronged attack, creating a front line measuring 400 miles or 640 kilometers in length. Between the 3 groups, Saddam's army had an estimated 150,000 soldiers and as many as 2,000 tanks. Iran had just as many or more. But, as we've already covered, much of their equipment was in poor condition or inoperable. The northern advance pushed only a few kilometers into Iran before setting up defensive positions, as this group was largely intended to defend Iraq's oil pipeline in the event of a counterattack. At the same time, the central advance quickly occupied the provincial capital, Marran, and continued to the edge of the Zagros Mountains. But of the 6 divisions that Iraq deployed in the initial stages of the invasion, 4 of them were sent to the southern front, into Iran's Khorramshahr province. And so, already at this stage in the war, analysts were beginning to speculate that the true motive for the invasion actually was to annex this province of Iran, which just happens to be rich in oil. Big surprise there. Perhaps the fears of Iranian revolutionary ideology were just a convenient warmongering tool. On the evening of the invasion's first day, Iraqi tanks rumbled into the Khuzestan province, pushing ahead at full speed, aiming for a blitzkrieg-style punch into the region. Their forces quickly reached the province's capital, Khorramshahr, which sat on the right bank of the Shatt al-Arab River. But instead of a steamrolling victory, the Iraqi divisions were met with a fierce and determined defense. First, they surrounded the city, forming a crescent shape around it, and they began blasting it with artillery. When the bombardment had finished, the entire city lay shrouded in smoke and rubble, with thousands of civilians killed on the city's western edge, and electricity and water completely cut off. The train station was also annihilated. But there was no time to admire their artillery's work. Immediately after the last shell had fallen, 500 Iraqi tanks were already heading down the main road, looking to enter the city. Somehow these tanks were held off by Iranian recall-less rifles, which disabled dozens and forced the rest to take a more cautious approach. By dawn of the next day, most of these anti-tank outposts had been neutralized, but it had taken precious time. By now, the Iranian forces in the city had already prepared layers of defenses. Taking a moment to plan the next phase of the assault, Iraqi forces finished encircling Khorramshahr, ensuring that it was now completely cut off from reinforcements, and then they began sending in thousands of troops. The Iranian forces within the city fought ferociously, fighting in close quarters with small arms, concentrating lethal fire on tanks from multiple rocket-propelled grenades, and even throwing Molotov cocktails. The real game changer was Iran's use of dozens of British-made Chieftain tanks, which almost always came out on top in a fight against the T-62s it was facing. And so, despite heavily outnumbering the defenders, Iraqi forces took such high casualties in this first attack that they completely withdrew from the city and reassessed their approach. After some analysis, they concentrated their attacks on critical infrastructure, such as its main bridge and its river ports. Using heavy shelling tactics and quick commando units, Iraq was able to take control of these pretty quickly, coming one step closer to taking the city. Day after day, the thunder of artillery shook the city as Iranian snipers fired out of windows and threw whatever they could at the advancing armor. But by November 1980, ammunition was low, exhaustion was high, and casualties or even higher. Once the Iraqi forces reached the center of the city, Iranian tanks struggled to fight in the narrow streets, and the defenders began fleeing the city. By November the 10th, Khorramshahr had fallen, and Iraq was now poised to take full control of Khuzestan. Saddam had hoped that the pressure of an invasion would be enough to make the Iranian people turn on their new Islamist government, but much to his surprise, he achieved quite the opposite. Iran viewed the war as a holy defense of their nation, and people lined up in the thousands to protect their land. Their armed forces, which had seemed so weakened before the war, were now filling up their ranks so quickly. struggling to keep up. Iran also wasn't completely on defense during the first weeks of the invasion. Immediately after Iraq's surprise bombing to kick off the war, Iran had whipped up their own retaliatory airstrikes. In total, more than 200 Iranian aircraft took to the skies, including 58 F-4s, 88 F-5s, and 60 F-14s. At least 140 of these aircraft crossed into Iraq and bombed 11 airbases, including Baghdad International Airport. To avoid radar detection, the aircraft had flown as close to the ground as possible on their way to their targets, flying so low that at times power cables are one of the biggest risks to the pilots, and in one case a billboard got caught on the tail of an F-4, and that wasn't discovered until the jet landed. These quick airstrikes were followed by several more aerial operations, including the daring Operation Scorched Sword, in which 4 Iranian F-4s flew deep into enemy territory and bombed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. They claimed that this was to prevent Iraq from developing and using nuclear weapons in the conflict, but they only did minor damage to the plant. Regardless, for his failure to detect the Iranian jet, Saddam ordered the execution of Colonel Fakhri Hussein Jaber, the head of Iraq's Western Defense Zone. Along with him, he also executed anyone above the rank of major that was associated with the failure. All the while, Iran's airstrikes kept coming. By the time Iraq occupied Khorramshahr, Iran had reportedly reduced their air capabilities by 50%. So essentially, Iraq was dominating the fight on the ground, but above them, Iran had achieved air superiority. There was no telling which way the tide of war would turn. The only certainty was that it was doomed to rage on. By late 1980, the Iraqi invasion had slowed to nearly a standstill. Iran's leaders saw this, and before the opportunity could slip away, they launched a counteroffensive codenamed Operation Victory, with the goal of kicking out the Iraqis and perhaps pushing even further. The main engagement of Operation Victory was the Battle of Dezful, a city in the Khuzestan province. This turned out to be the largest tank battle of the entire war, with 330 Iranian tanks facing off against 350 Iraqi tanks. The Iranian tanks were mostly of US and British origin, while the Iraqi tanks were mostly of Soviet origin, but the real factor that determined this battle's outcome was strategy. Iran launched several diversionary attacks before Operation Victory began in January 1981, but the Iraqis were not fooled. They'd placed their tanks in critical locations along important roads and even dug some of their T-72s into the muddy hillsides. Once the armored divisions were in sight of each other, the battle was remarkably one-sided, as Iranian tank formations were disorganized and their infantry inexperienced. Iraq, on the other hand, had infantry equipped with various anti-tank weapons and attack helicopters on standby. In the slaughter that ensued, 214 Iranian tanks were destroyed, along with 100 infantry fighting vehicles. Iraq emerged with only 45 tanks lost to combat, 50 infantry fighting vehicles, and 3 of their helicopters. Iran suffered a major defeat in Operation Victory, but fortunately for them, Iraq wasn't able to capitalize on the momentum. As both sides dug in defensive lines and launched pointless attacks on each other, a strange pattern was emerging. Miles and miles of trenches lined with barbed wire. Each side lost thousands of men in vain attempts to cross no man's land, trying their best to break the stalemate, but the trenches were too hard to crack and tanks were too vulnerable during the advance across no man's land to be of much use. Frustrated with the deadlock, Iraq had begun using chemical weapons, including mustard and chlorine gas. Illegal weapons according to the Geneva Convention, of course, but Saddam didn't seem to care. Now, if the picture that we've just painted for you seems oddly familiar, it's probably because it's eerily reminiscent of the First World War. Imagine the Western Front in 1916, except instead of France, it's in the desert, with supersonic fighter jets soaring overhead instead of biplanes. And this anachronistic scene would last for much of 1981. Iraq hoped that such brutal combat would tire out their enemies, but stories from the front line only invigorated more Iranians to enlist in the armed forces. And with so many fresh soldiers at their disposal, Iran began one of the most horrifying tactics yet: human waves. Essentially, huge crowds of lightly armed Iranian soldiers would flood a weak point in the Iraqi trenches, and despite taking absolutely massive casualties, they would often overpower the defenders by sheer numbers. After these waves had reached their target, they would be followed by reinforcements of mechanized divisions. Thousands upon thousands of Iranians died in these bloody charges, but they were ultimately successful in breaking through several defensive lines. But the front line, it didn't shift much overall. The most notable event in this period of the war was Operation Opera, a risky airstrike carried out by the Israeli Air Force that finished destroying Iraq's nuclear reactor. By 1982, Iran was ready for another counter-offensive. Since Iraq had denied their first Operation Victory, they threw together the sequel, Operation Undeniable Victory, with the lofty goal of liberating the Khuzestan province. The battle began with Iran thundering forward in a two-pronged attack, aiming for a pincer movement around the Iraqi forces. The ensuing battles were some of the bloodiest and most chaotic of the 20th century. Thousands of tanks facing off in the desert, the deafening screams of jets overhead, and the horror of human wave attacks. But this time, there would be no stalemate. Within just 6 days, Iran had encircled and annihilated 3 entire Iraqi divisions, resulting in the staggering loss of 25,000 men and 20,000 more captured. 361 Iraqi tanks had been destroyed, along with 18 aircraft and more than 300 other vehicles. Iraq's southern corridor had just been smashed in, and a retreat was ordered. The Iraqi forces retreated to Khorramshahr, which they had taken in the early months of the war nearly 2 years ago. But this time, Iran had the upper hand. And after yet another unbelievably brutal battle in May 1982, which resulted in 20,000 more casualties and another 500 destroyed tanks, Khorramshahr was liberated and Iraq was forced to retreat once again, this time pushed almost all the way back to the pre-war border. Saddam was so upset with his army's failure that he executed anyone he deemed responsible for the retreat, which ended up being more than 200 individuals. Iran had miraculously achieved their operational goals in the southwest. Operation Undeniable Victory had been a huge success, and with their enemies now retreating at full speed, Iran showed no signs of stopping. Not only had the invasion of Iran been an overall failure, the tides were now turning against Iraq as Iranian forces continued to build up along the border, poised to invade at any moment. Saddam, in a bit of a desperate move, announced that he was suing for peace, offering an immediate ceasefire and a complete withdrawal from Iranian territory in 14 days. But the supreme leader of Iran was no longer interested in peace, and he declared that not only would Iran invade Iraq, but that they wouldn't stop fighting until Saddam's regime had been toppled and replaced with an Islamic republic. Back in Baghdad, the Iraqi government scrambled to come up with their response. Some suggested new military offensives, but the army was in far too poor of a condition for that. The Minister of Health suggested that Saddam could momentarily step down to appease Iran, and after peace had been negotiated, he could return to power. Saddam asked if anyone else in the cabinet agreed with the proposal, and when no hands were raised, he escorted the man to the next room and shot him in the head with his pistol before resuming the meeting. The message was clear. It didn't matter how bad things were going to get. Saddam would never back down. And he had reason to be confident in his army. Despite losing tens of thousands of soldiers in the war so far, he still had an active army of more than 200,000 men and was receiving plenty of international aid. Countries supporting Iraq included the United States, who provided information from spy satellites after declaring that they could not, under any circumstances, let Iraq lose the war. France sold various helicopters and Mirage F-1 fighter jets, and the Soviet Union, displeased with Iran for destroying its local communist party, began selling tanks and spare parts to Iraq. Iran, on the other hand, was still under strict economic sanctions and had to rely on importing ammunition and weapons from China, Pakistan, and North Korea. Despite this economic disadvantage, Iran did have one trump card: their morale. Propaganda across Iran depicted the war as a holy conflict, that there was glory in martyrdom for Allah, bringing boys as young as 12 to sign up by the thousands to prove their allegiance. And with so many soldiers at their disposal, Iran was now ready to follow through with their promise to overthrow Saddam's regime. Initially, the plan was to launch an all-out attack on Baghdad, but Iranian leadership rejected the idea as too risky. Instead, they decided it would be more effective to focus on capturing smaller provinces, push slowly through the country, and hopefully turn the population against Saddam. On July the 13th, 1982, Iran's offensive began, codenamed Operation Undeniable, not really. It was codenamed Operation Ramadan. More than 100,000 Iranian troops charged forward in huge waves, just as they had done before, throwing themselves at the weak points in Iraqi defenses. But Iraq was ready for these waves this time, and they had entrenched artillery and tanks to counter these human floods, and Iran suffered unimaginable losses in the first days of fighting. Iraq also deployed large amounts of tear gas, sending entire battalions into disarray as they choked on the fumes, making them easy targets for artillery and helicopter strikes. But Iran had plenty of men to spare, and those who fell were quickly replaced. After 3 days, they had pushed 16 kilometers deep into Iraqi territory before Iraqi airstrikes forced them back to near the border. A few days later, they pushed 13 kilometers in and were pushed back once again, this time on the verge of total annihilation, narrowly escaping encirclement. A couple of weeks later, they attacked for a final desperate time, capturing a small amount of Iraqi land before the fighting died down. Operation Ramadan only lasted a few weeks, but it had resulted in more than 20,000 deaths, 80,000 wounded, and thousands of destroyed vehicles, all to occupy just 50 square kilometers of Iraqi territory. As one historian put it, Operation Ramadan was, by any standard, a criminal failure of leadership and strategy. Iran had gained essentially nothing of strategic value, save for destroying a good number of Iraqi tanks, but it had come at a price far, far too high. Following the failed offensive, the war began shifting back to one of attrition as both sides continued to launch attacks across the vast front line to no avail. Iran's human wave tactics were even used to clear minefields, which, as you can imagine, resulted in unbelievable loss of life. Throughout 1983 and 1984, Iran launched 10 separate Operation Dawns, most of which didn't achieve very much, except Operation Dawn 4, which retook some territory in the north. Throughout these months, they began shifting away from the human wave tactics and started trying out new approaches, such as marsh battles, where they would engage Iraqi forces while wading through the thick water and mud, often at night. It was hoped that these wetlands would be a favorable way to sneak through the Iraqi defenses. But as Iranian forces advanced through the wet terrain, they encountered mustard gas, underwater electrical wires, and poisoned water. These marshes quickly became one of the deadliest places in the war, a certain death sentence to any soldier that was assigned to them. In 1984, Syria, who was on Iran's side in this whole affair, closed a crucial pipeline that killed off Iraq's oil exports. Losing those exports was catastrophic for the country's economy, which was now losing billions of dollars every month. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait stepped in to provide economic assistance, but it had all given Saddam a new idea. If he began attacking Iranian merchant ships, perhaps he could get Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, a crucial waterway for oil tankers that provides the only route from the Persian Gulf to the open sea. If this were to close, foreign superpowers would certainly intervene, and the war could be ended in no time at all. And so, in 1984, Iraq began targeting Iranian ships, civilian and military alike. Generally using helicopters and attack planes purchased from France, dozens of Iranian ships were struck, set ablaze, and even sunk throughout the next year. Iran responded with similar attacks, and in what became known as the Tanker Wars, ships from all nations were targeted. And just as Saddam had hoped, the world's eyes were now on their oil supplies, and several Western nations deployed warships to protect their commerce. But the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, went above and beyond the rest, allowing friendly tankers to be reflagged with the American stars and stripes, granting them protection from the US Navy. It was a super risky decision, risking the total involvement of the United States, but even the presence of powerful navies wasn't enough to stop the attacks. The closest the US came to getting directly involved came when the USS Stark was targeted by an Iraqi jet, which fired 2 missiles at the vessel, striking its port side. The second missile penetrated the hull and exploded in crew quarters, killing 37 and injuring 21. It was never determined if the attack was intentional, and the pilot went unpunished back in Iraq for his actions. Saudi Arabia was also nearly pulled into the conflict when they scrambled 2 F-15 fighters to protect one of their shipping vessels and ended up shooting down 2 Iranian F-4s. While the tanker wars raged on at sea, Iraq had finally begun to dominate the skies over Iran. The lack of spare parts and engineers was taking its toll on Iran, who, as the war progressed, could no longer seriously compete with Iraq for air superiority. Saddam ordered the so-called War of the Cities to begin, in which huge squadrons embarked on bombing runs across Iranian cities. These included some of the largest-scale bombing missions since the end of World War II, and civilian deaths skyrocketed into the tens of thousands in 11 major cities. Iraq also began importing Soviet-made Scud missiles and launched these at civilian targets anywhere that they pleased. Iran responded with their own bombing runs, specifically targeting Baghdad. Iraq's use of mustard bombs also increased as they began importing more of the necessary chemicals, and in one attack on the city of Shah Dast, more than 100 civilians were killed and 5,000 were burned and injured by the toxic substance. Throughout 1986 and 1987, while each side continued various attacks along the front line, Saddam sent multiple offers for a ceasefire, but Iran had rejected all of them, determined to win the war. Both sides were enacting policies of total war, and Iraq had even started to draft university students. But the attitude really began to change in 1988 when Iraq stepped up the terror attacks. Fueled by massive amounts of weapons imports, Iraq's army had nearly doubled in size over the last couple of years, and since they were now spending more than 50% of their entire GDP on the war, their military industry was booming, especially missile production. More than 500 missiles in total were fired at Iranian cities, and Iran struggled to respond. Saddam then threatened to begin using chemical weapons in the long-range missiles, causing 30% of Tehran's population to flee the city immediately. The supreme leader of Iran, now faced with potential weapons of mass destruction and a second Iraqi invasion that would be stronger than the first, accepted UN Resolution 598 and began working toward a ceasefire, which was signed in August 1988, ending all hostilities between the countries. The Iran-Iraq War had resulted in almost no territorial changes whatsoever, with both sides returning to their pre-war boundaries. It had, however, decimated hundreds of cities, and the total number of casualties is somewhere in the ballpark of 2 million people, more than half of which were from the vicious combat on the front lines. Both nations were severely in debt after the war ended, and while Iran would slowly work on rebuilding their country, it was this debt and the newly strengthened army that would lead Iraq to make another terrible decision when they invaded Kuwait in 1990. This time, however, they would be no match for the coalition forces they faced. Iraq's use of chemical weapons against Iran were met at the time with international scorn. But not only did many countries condemn the use of such weapons, the experience from the Iran-Iraq War added serious credibility to the accusations that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction in the 21st century, which ultimately led the United States to invade Iraq in 2003. In the end, Saddam's invasion of Iran in 1980 had not only sparked one of the deadliest wars in recent history, but also perhaps started a domino effect that ended with his regime being destroyed, and with him being executed by his own people.